There are moments in a man's life that strip away everything he has built, every wall he has carefully constructed, every mask he has spent decades perfecting. For Richard Gere, one of Hollywood's most enigmatic and enduring stars, that moment came not under the blinding lights of a film set or in the thunderous applause of a packed cinema, but in the quiet stillness of a sunlit afternoon in Italy, when a woman walked into his life and made him forget every role he had ever played. He was 75 years old when he sat down in a rare and deeply personal interview and said words that silenced the room. Words that no publicist had scripted, no director had rehearsed with him, and no studio had approved. With his voice carrying the weight of 3 marriages, decades of spiritual searching, and a lifetime of learning what love truly means, Richard Gere looked into the camera and said simply, quietly, and with complete conviction, "She was the love of my life." The world paused, because this was not a man who spoke carelessly. This was not a celebrity performing vulnerability for attention. This was a man who had spent the better part of 50 years running from something he could not name, and had finally, in the autumn of his life, found the courage to be still. To understand what those words meant, you have to understand the journey that led him there. You have to go back to the beginning, to a quiet boy in New York who learned very early that performing was safer than feeling, and that wearing a mask was easier than showing the world your real face. Richard Tiffany Gere was born on August 31st, 1949, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the second of 5 children in a working-class family that eventually settled in Syracuse, New York. From the outside, his childhood looked ordinary enough. But inside that ordinary-looking boy was something restless, something searching, something that did not quite fit the world around him. He was drawn to music from a very young age. He taught himself to play multiple instruments, including the trumpet, guitar, and piano, and he found in music what he could not find in ordinary conversation, a language for the things he felt but could not say. Music gave him a private world, a place where he could be completely honest without the danger of being truly seen. This tension between expression and concealment would define Richard Gere for most of his adult life. He was a deeply sensitive person who had learned, as many sensitive people do, that the world is not always kind to sensitivity. So he built walls. He cultivated mystery. He learned to give people the performance they were looking for while keeping the real Richard safely hidden somewhere behind his own eyes. When he began studying philosophy at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, this inner complexity deepened rather than simplified. He was not interested in the surface of things. He wanted to understand existence itself, the nature of the mind, the mechanics of suffering, the possibility of genuine peace. These were not questions that Hollywood was particularly interested in answering, but they were the questions that mattered most to him. He left college before finishing his degree, drawn toward theater and eventually toward film. And as his career began to climb, as audiences fell in love with the brooding intensity he brought to every role, Richard Gere found himself living a strange double life. On the outside, he was everything the entertainment industry celebrated: handsome, magnetic, successful, and mysterious. On the inside, he was a man who felt increasingly uncomfortable with everything that fame required of him. In 1978, something happened that would permanently alter the course of Richard Gere's life, not just spiritually, but romantically. He traveled to Nepal and India, and while moving through the ancient landscape of the Himalayas, he encountered Tibetan Buddhist teachings for the first time. He sat with monks in temples that had stood for centuries. He listened to teachers explain concepts about impermanence, about the illusions that cause human suffering, about the difference between desire and genuine love. He learned that most of what people call love is actually a form of grasping, a desperate attempt to hold on to something that makes us feel complete because we do not yet feel complete within ourselves. This was a revelation that would take him decades to fully understand, but it planted a seed that never stopped growing. As the 1980s transformed him into one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, as he was named among the most desirable men in the world, as magazine covers and red carpets and box office records accumulated around him, Richard Gere was quietly persistently asking a different set of questions than most people in his position were asking. Not, how do I become more famous, but what is this all for? Not, who should I be seen with, but who am I when no one is watching? These are not easy questions to ask when you are at the height of Hollywood's most coveted social hierarchy. And the honest answer is that Richard Gere spent many years not fully living up to the answers he already knew. He was still performing, still moving fast, still keeping people at arm's length, even the people he genuinely cared for. His early romantic relationships carried the hallmarks of a man who had not yet learned to be still. They were intense, genuine in their feeling, but ultimately unsustainable because Richard himself was not yet in one place long enough for anything to truly take root. When he met Cindy Crawford in the late 1980s, the world witnessed what looked like the perfect pairing of two extraordinary people at the absolute peak of their powers. She was the most photographed woman on the planet. He was one of Hollywood's most celebrated leading men. Their connection was real, their chemistry undeniable, and their shared moments genuinely warm. But beneath the surface of what the world saw, two people were living at completely different speeds. Cindy Crawford was in her early 20s, still discovering who she was, energized by the extraordinary opportunities her career was generating, curious about the world and her place in it. Richard, a decade and a half older, was already exhausted by the very thing she was just beginning to explore. He was pulling inward while she was reaching outward. He was seeking silence while she was still learning to love the noise. They married in 1991, and their wedding, a private ceremony in Las Vegas without the elaborate production their public profiles might have suggested, was in many ways a reflection of the contradiction at the heart of their relationship. They were trying to hold onto something they both sensed was slipping, try to give permanence to what was still fundamentally unresolved. By 1995, it was over, and the end of that marriage left Richard Gere with something he had not fully anticipated. A loneliness that no amount of career success, spiritual practice, or public adoration could fill. He had been loved by one of the most admired women in the world, and it had not been enough. Not because she was lacking, but because he himself was still incomplete. This, he would later understand, was the real lesson of those years. You cannot build a lasting home with another person until you have built one within yourself. After the public chapter of his marriage to Cindy Crawford closed, Richard Gere made a choice that surprised many people in Hollywood. He stepped back. He did not rush into another high-profile relationship. He did not fill the silence with noise. Instead, he leaned into the spiritual practice that had been calling to him since that journey through the Himalayas nearly 2 decades earlier. He met Carrie Lowell, an actress who was in many ways the opposite of the world he had been living in. She was grounded, private, and genuinely unbothered by the machinery of celebrity. They built something quieter together, something that had room for meditation and reflection and the slower rhythms Richard had always craved. In 2000, their son Homer was born, and in the experience of becoming a father, Richard Gere discovered something that all the philosophy he had studied and all the meditation he had practiced had only pointed toward without fully delivering. He discovered what it meant to love without condition, without performance, without any expectation of return. A child does not care about your box office records. A child does not love you because you are mysterious or magnetic or celebrated. A child simply needs you to be present. And in learning to be present for Homer, Richard Gere began, slowly and imperfectly, to learn to be present for himself. But even that relationship, warm and genuine as it was, eventually ran its course. By the time their separation became public in 2013, Richard was in his mid-60s, and the questions he had been asking since he was a young man in a university library were more urgent than ever. He had been loved. He had been married. He had been a father. And yet something essential still felt unfinished. In 2014, Richard Gere was in Positano, Italy. He was not there to be seen. He was not there to work. He was simply there in one of the world's most quietly beautiful places, trying to rest and to think. He was staying at a hotel owned by a prominent Spanish family. And it was there, in that unhurried Mediterranean setting, that he met Alejandra Silva. She was 33 years old to his 65. She had her own story of loss and recovery, having recently separated from her husband and navigating the emotional aftermath of a marriage that had ended. She was not looking for a Hollywood romance. She was not looking to be anyone's accessory or trophy. She was simply a woman trying to find her footing again, and she encountered a man who was doing exactly the same thing. What happened between them in those first conversations was not the electric, cinematic lightning bolt that Richard Gere had once associated with love. It was something quieter and, ultimately, far more powerful. It was recognition, the feeling of seeing someone and knowing, without being able to fully explain why, that this person understands something essential about what it means to be alive. Richard did not rush. For perhaps the first time in his romantic life, he was genuinely patient. He sent her flowers. He wrote her letters by hand. He expressed himself not through grand gestures designed to impress, but through small, consistent acts of genuine attention. He was not trying to win her. He was simply trying to show her who he actually was, the real man, not the star, not the performance, not the carefully maintained mystery. Alejandra was cautious. There were significant differences between them in age, in background, in the worlds they had each inhabited. But what she found in Richard Gere was something she had not expected to find. A man who was not asking her to be anything other than herself. A man who had no interest in shaping her, or impressing her, or keeping her at a convenient distance. A man who was, for the first time in his own life, completely and genuinely present. They married in April 2018 in a private Buddhist ceremony that reflected both of their inner lives. Alejandra had come to share Richard's Buddhist faith, not because he had asked her to or because it was convenient for the relationship, but because it resonated with something she already carried within herself. This was, for Richard, the most extraordinary thing. He had finally found someone whose spiritual rhythm matched his own. They moved into the farmhouse in Pound Ridge, New York, that Richard had owned for years, a place surrounded by nature and insulated from the chaos of celebrity. In the life they built, there was nothing like the life Richard Gere had lived during his years at Hollywood Center. The mornings began quietly. There were children, including 2 young sons born to Richard and Alejandra, and the sounds of their life together were the sounds of crayons on paper